May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. A lot can happen in just 40 days. To put it in perspective, what were you doing on Christmas? Because the Feast of the Presentation, which we celebrate today, is exactly 40 days after Christmas. Many of us were here for a long time celebrating Christmas. And that's kind of our starting point, because what's happened since then? Around the world, probably the biggest international news is a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, ending almost a year and a half of conflict that many of us felt was growing increasingly hopeless by the day. This is only a temporary ceasefire, which, interestingly, is scheduled to last for 42 days, while they negotiate a permanent ceasefire to hopefully end this conflict. As a nation, we said goodbye to a beloved former president when we laid Jimmy Carter to rest, someone who spent the second half of his life as a statesman and a humanitarian and helped so many. And we also watched the peaceful transition of power as the Biden administration ended and the Trump administration began. Here at All Saints, we have welcomed new members to our parish through birth and through baptism, and we have also said goodbye to several longtime members of our parish who are still with us on Christmas Day. And our hearts are grieving, but we know that they are at peace. As eventful as these 40 days have been for us in our time and in our place, our gospel reading today talks about a period of 40 days in which almost nothing happened. Because they are very careful, according to Luke, Mary and Joseph, to follow the law of God, which is laid out in Leviticus 12. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Leviticus 12, after the birth of a male son, the mother and the son are both ritually unclean for a period of 40 days. Now, this has nothing to do with sin or guilt, anything like that. This has everything to do with how the ancient people of Israel understood blood and blood diseases and the possibility of blood-borne contamination. And so if someone was sick or if someone was bleeding, there was a certain prescribed period of time in which they were to take care of themselves and rest before they presented themselves in the temple to be proclaimed clean or pure by the priest, who also functioned kind of as a doctor in a sort of way, before they were allowed to return to society. The only exception for this, of course, was the 8th day, when the family was to take the newborn to the temple so that he could be circumcised and named. And other than that, the mother and baby were both to stay as far away from society, specifically the temple and the holy things that have been consecrated to the Lord, including all of the priests, because the possibility of contamination could really upend society. So here is this holy family on their second outing, on their second trip to the temple. But this time things go a little bit differently, because there are two people waiting for them on this day, two people who are well known in the community for their piety and for their devotion. And they take this tiny baby in their arms, and they speak incredible things over this newborn. Simeon is first, and he says that this is a light to the entire world, the glory of the people of Israel, but also a light to the Gentiles. This continues Luke's theme that he establishes early in his gospel, in which Luke says that Jesus is not only the Messiah of the Jewish people, he is in fact the Savior of the world. And his mission is to bring all of humanity into right relationship with God. Next up is Anna, an 84-year-old widow who prays night and day in the temple, according to Luke, who, when she encounters this baby, leaves and proclaims the joyous news to everyone that she meets, that the day has come and the promise has been revealed. And as a little aside, I love this one small comment that Luke puts in here. His father and mother were amazed. I think that is perhaps the biggest understatement of the year. Because if this had been my baby that people were speaking these things over, my 40-day-old infant, there we go, I think I would have been gobsmacked, but I doubt Luke knew that word then. So we get amazed. What is this tradition that these two holy people, Simeon and Anna, cling to? What is it that they see in the hope of this little one, just 40 days old? I think one clue we get comes from our reading in the prophet Malachi. If you don't know the prophet Malachi well, his writing comes near the end of the Hebrew Bible, and he is in fact one of the latest prophets writing in the centuries before Christ. And he says that the day of the Lord is coming, and it sounds a little bit apocalyptic. But he compares it to two things, refiner's fire and fuller's soap. And if you don't know what fuller's soap is, it is a very caustic lie. It's basically what we would call bleach today. It is for taking stains out of garments that are soiled. So, for this prophet, the day of the Lord is a day of purification. It's a day when all things will be cleaned and made pure and made right. It's a day that we know that the offerings of Israel will again be acceptable in the sight of the Lord as they were in the former times. But yet we don't hear in this passage what it is that the people need to be cleansed from. That comes a few verses later when the prophet specifically names sorcery, adultery, deceit, defrauding other people that you owe money to, particularly the people that you work for, and then failing to care for the weak and the marginalized among you, specifically the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. And here's the thing, this doesn't sound like a very complicated list, because our tendency as people, not just living in the 21st century, but as people in general, who did this even in the times of the Bible. We want a list, we want a checklist, a simple list of do's and don'ts. If we just do this, if I just remember to be nice to widows, I can check that box and move on. Jesus talked about this often when he talked about the fact that the religious folks of his time would make sure to tithe on their spices, but yet they would neglect to care for the poor and the needy among them. You see, what Malachi is suggesting here, I think, is that the law of God is not based on a simple checkbox system. The law of God is the law of love, and it's complicated. We like things spelled out. We like a big sign that says speed limit 35. And we know that if we go over 35, we might be in trouble. We like maps that show boundaries around private property. And we know that if we trespass into somebody else's property, we might be in trouble. But when it comes to doing the right thing born out of love, there are not clear boundaries and simple rules. But yet, the prophet tells us that the dream of God is the day when all people will learn to live in harmony and respect with one another. And in fact, that is what the writer of Hebrews suggests is the entire purpose of the life of Jesus. Because we needed a high priest who could understand us, who could identify with us. And Jesus was a different kind of priest, not the kind of priest who kept people in need at arm's length because of the fear of ritual impurity. No, in fact, the gospel is full of stories of Jesus reaching a hand out to help those who were bleeding, who were injured, who were leprous, and offering them a chance to be restored into the community, not just of faith, but of life. He is a priest who is there with people in their suffering at every step of the way, crossing boundaries and offering hope, not only to those who are ritually impure, but to all of humanity, Jew and Gentile alike. Jesus was God here with us, in relationship with us, teaching us what it looks like to be in relationship with one another, and to let the law of love guide our hearts and our actions. That is the hope of the prophet Malachi, that we will see this come to pass. It is the hope that Simeon and Anna see in this tiny little baby brought to the temple just 40 days after he was born. And it is the hope that continues to give life to our church today. For those of you who did not hear the news, this Friday, our presiding bishop, Sean Rowe, made an announcement that Episcopal Migration Ministries will no longer be able to operate in the way that it has for decades. For those of you who aren't familiar with the work of EMM, it is one of the oldest and largest outreach ministries of the Episcopal Church. And for generations, they have helped people coming to the United States as refugees resettle. They've offered them support, help with English classes, placement in schools, basically anything a family could need to start their life over in this country. EMM was there to put an arm around them and to help them and to guide them. But because of changes in policy, immigration has become significantly harder, and the funds to support refugee resettlement are no longer available. And so EMM is going to have to figure out what it is that they can continue to do to serve people in vulnerable positions. And I think this is sad news for those of us who have partnered with Episcopal Migration Ministries in the past. When I was a brand new priest at Christ Church of the Ascension, as the war in Afghanistan was winding down and there was an influx of Afghan refugees coming to the United States, people who had helped the United States in their effort against the Taliban, EMM sent out a desperate call to churches where Afghan refugee families were going to be resettling. And Phoenix was one of those places. And so, after talking it over with our rector, I volunteered us to be one of those churches. And I am humbled by the work that we were able to do, because in just 1 month, the folks at Christ Church of the Ascension banded together, and we collected enough home goods to furnish 2 apartments for families seeking a new start in the Phoenix area. It was amazing. And the people in the congregation banded together. The choir said, you know what? We can pool our resources and help out with baby stuff. And they brought in boxes of diapers and bottles, crib mats and wipes, anything that you could need to care for a little baby. The Altar Guild said, we know everything there is to know about linens. And they brought in towels and bed sheets, boxes of supplies. Even the kids in the parish in Sunday school got involved. They bought coloring books and toys. They bought bed sheets and shoes to try to give these kids a little bit of hope in a desperate moment in their lives. And they wrote cards to all of these families. They put them in the boxes with the pots and the pans and the plates, with the towels and the bed sheets and everything else we collected. I was proud of the work that we were able to do in a short amount of time. And more than that, I was proud of the way that it brought our community together in common purpose, and in common mission. And that is our sacred call, to carry on the work of Christ, to be a light to enlighten the nations. And the winds of politics or popular opinion do not affect the work that we are called to do. But we can't help it when we hear news like this, because we're human, and we get overwhelmed, and we throw our hands up and say, well, what are we supposed to do now? Or we grit our teeth and say, now it's really up to us to change the world, as if we could do that on our own anyway. The reality is that neither of those reactions are particularly helpful, because we know that the work that we have been called to do is hard, and we cannot give up when we face obstacles and setbacks along the way. And we also cannot feel like we're going to go out and change the world by ourselves, because when we start down that road, we will quickly realize that the task is just too big for anything that we can do by ourselves. I don't think we're all that good with big, lofty goals. How many of us, just 1 month into the year, have already amended or abandoned those New Year's resolutions that we started January 1st? But here's what I do know. A lot can happen in just 40 days. Maybe it's time for us to think about a new horizon, to ask ourselves a new question. What can we do in the next 40 days, in a little less than 6 weeks, to carry our mission forward? Between now and Friday, March 14th, who can we help? How can we serve? What can we do individually, as teams within this congregation, and as an entire community of faith, to be a light to enlighten the nations? My friends, on this feast of the presentation, on this day when we celebrate Candlemas and remind ourselves that Jesus is the light of the world, we also need to be reminded that people around the world are in need of the light of hope to illuminate their lives and their situation. We can't fix it all, but if we commit ourselves to do something, a lot can happen in 40 days.